Make sure Patty's ready back there.
Gotta wait till 9 o'clock.
Oh,
One more minute there.
Calm down, Turbo.
it's 5 seconds.
She says it's okay.
You're okay? All right, let's call it to order. Let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to. Let's start together, everybody.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. We stay standing for our invocation. We gathered together here today, intent on doing good work. We seek to represent fairly and well those who have given us this task. May our efforts be blessed with insight, guided by understanding and wisdom. We seek to serve with respect for all. May our personal faiths give us strength to act honestly and well in all matters before us. Thank you. First item is the approval of minutes.
I moved to approve the minutes from October 9th.
I'll second.
Anybody have any comments before we vote?
Yes. I have a typo on page 2, approval of minutes number 1. There, it says approved. It should be approved, no D.
Where are you? Page 2.
Page 2 of the packet.
Mm-hmm.
Approval of minutes number 1. Motion. LPA.
Oh, down, approval of minutes.
Right.
Okay,
LPA member Plummer moved to approved. Should be
okay.
approved.
Oh. Got it.
Got it,
Just
Jason?
delete the D. I think that's all I had.
Mr. Hughes? Okay.
Microwave, or microphone, please. Microwave.
On page 7 of the packet, in the paragraph at the top of the page, about 1 to 3, 6 lines down, where it says agreed that findings, conclusions, and conditions could be included. I'm quite sure I said, or should have said, should be included, and not could be. It was, well, the other one is me just trying to make something clearer. We're down in the next to last sentence. To review large documents. It wasn't large documents. It was a large number of documents in a packet. So if we could, I'm not complaining about large documents.
Yeah.
I complained about that, and it was responded to by Director Green properly, saying that the documents, by referring to the packet rather than a document. Go with that.
Anyone else? You want to amend for those changes? Amend your motion for approval.
I'll amend to those changes,
Okay.
yes.
You still second?
Lori?
Laurie?
Yes.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Meetings from last are approved from our last meeting. Next on the agenda is a presentation, environmental critical LDC updates.
Jason Green, Community Development. Sarah's going to walk through this and describe what we're doing, but basically it's part of the Land Development Code updates. This one just is on your packet solely because of, I would say, the amount of changes, and give us some time to talk about it as we move forward.
Good morning. Sarah Probst, Community Development. As we were working through this Land Development Code update, we ran across several issues with the environmentally critical zoning district sections. We found that information was provided in multiple places and maybe not always in the place that made the most sense. We found that there weren't enough definitions and that it was somewhat confusing. So we were seeking to make these sections make more sense and provide the correct information in each section. We also made it so that each structure or any structure that's being built in the environmentally critical district is a special exception. So it will come before the legislation, or the council, the planning board and the council for approval rather than any of it being done administratively. Yes.
I hate to interrupt you, but I was just wondering, just so I could be clear in my mind, do you have a map of these areas? Is this just the area that's down from the Holiday Inn to wherever it ends?
No, this is the section of the beach, all along the beach side, from the 1987, I believe, coastal control construction line. One addition that the attorney mentioned that we should make is referencing a survey definition, not a definition, a survey description of that property. It's the entire length of the island.
Correct, 1978.
Okay.
The
Just gonna ask.
1978 coastal, or Lee County coastal construction line is a platted line, part of the public records, and that's what our code and our comp plan represent, or recognizes the recreation future land use category and the EC zoning district.
We had at one time, we had big maps up here that showed
Right.
that. And unfortunately, now we have, fortunately, we have a beautiful mural now. But it did show, our documents do show that, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
so it's basically the beach, essentially,
Yeah.
wherever that 78 line is where the
There-
EC starts.
And we do have an official survey of that.
There's no part of the EC that's not, that, it's all below the coastal construction line, correct?
Yes.
Well, for right now, but remember the comp plan, the LDC talk about, we
Yeah.
haven't actually physically changed that. We've used that line consistently, but they call out and say as the beach changes,
Yeah.
that line should change. We haven't done that, but, so right now it matches the 78 line.
So when you say that any of these structures that are connected with this will have to be, like, every beachfront house, every beachfront?
No, at this time, we don't really allow construction in the
Right.
EC. So basically, where most of the houses end, where most of the pools end along the beach, that is where the EC begins. People have sought to build some structures in those areas, and we just want to make sure that there's additional oversight because those are protected areas.
So currently now, there are no structures presently forward of the CCL line.
There are some, there aren't many.
Okay.
Well, you've got some commercial businesses that have outdoor seating and some other things that are seaward of that. You have, I mean, if you remember going through the TPI conversation, they have a portion of their property that has existing, I think it was part seawall and part other things that were seaward of that. So it's kind of scattered throughout. I think yesterday or last week we had a permit or somebody coming in to redesign a house and they had a portion of their deck across that line. So it depends on when it was built and when, but traditionally the town has not at this point really approved a lot of stuff. Maybe minor things, patios or that sort of thing, but I don't believe that there's ever been a house approved across that line.
If one was to ask for the exact EC control line, does the town have it? Is it on a website? Where can
Yes.
they access that?
We were going to include, after speaking with our attorney, he mentioned that we should include where they can find that survey. He recommended the clerk's office, but we do have a copy of it here in our office. However you guys would like to include that, we can do that.
I would love to get a copy of it. I mean, is it accessible for all of us?
Yes, I had a copy of it last week. I can get one for you.
Well, we have document that shows that.
But we
Yes.
haven't
Yeah,
never
we
had,
do.
the town had, they never had a actual survey, because that's why we've had so many disputes.
No, so the line is platted and recorded in the public records of Lee County.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is,
It's
it is
shown
a
on our-
survey,
on our
meets and
comp-
bounds, not meets and bounds, but description. of where that line is. It's been challenging, I think, for people that aren't familiar with it or where it is buried in those records to find it. So if you're a surveyor, my understanding is if you're a surveyor that is new to town and have never done it, it's hard to find. But regardless of that, we have our zoning maps that recognize the EC district, and that is mapped and identified through GIS and all that. So when you go to Leespins or you go to LIPA, they have those lines on there. You can turn on the 78 line, you can turn on Leespins, you can turn on our zoning district as an overlay, and it'll show up where that line is. And they should match.
And there's the later coastal construction line,
Right, there's the 91, the DEP.
the
91 line.
91, which moves it to Estero Boulevard,
Right.
essentially. In answer to an earlier question, there are a lot of buildings that do encroach on the coastal construction line, including Smuggler's Cove. Our properties are about 10 feet over the coastal construction line. And and so are a lot of the condos. But that was pre-existed, those are pre-existing buildings.
And remember, so what Sarah's talking about with what we've done here is it changes a little bit, but the most part, what you're talking about, decks and, or a house or something like that, they've always required a special exception. This really just kind of makes everything else, for the most part, redefines it as trying to go through the same process, unless it's truly a temporary, removable, or limited kind of in scope type of structure or use, which is really what the intent, I think, was, and it was just not clear through the regulations of what process you were supposed to use. So, and I don't think you went over moving stuff around, if you want to cover some of that.
Okay, yeah. When we were looking at these sections of code, if you look at section 34-652, we added in the section from section 6-366, location of construction near beaches. That was one of the confusing parts of this, that they weren't just covering location in that section, so we moved B, occasional minor structures, to section 34-652, because we thought that made more sense, because that was a section where we're talking about how things are permitted and what is permitted.
Mayor Chairman, yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I think that was a good idea by taking those provisions out of 366 and moving into 652. But the definition, I would like to point out that the phrase minor structures is defined. You have a new definition for it. You've added a new definition for it on the very last page, 16. But it's also on page 10, there's a reference to minor, and there's
11.
and also on 11, and they're not consistent. There's some provisions in some that are not included in others. And I think that should be another look taken at that before finalizing this.
Actually, the way I put that together is I took all of the definitions for minor structure from these sections and put it into the definitions. So those were all of the definitions. If you don't feel that they're appropriate, if there are certain things that you don't feel define a minor structure, we can revise that. But I wanted to put all of that information in there. I know that's a very long, cumbersome definition, but I basically put that in there so you could see how many different ways minor structure was defined and give you the opportunity to narrow it down to something you felt was more appropriate.
Well, I agree they should be all, but they aren't all in there. Tents aren't in there. Volleyball courts aren't in there. So, and
So the struggle was defining it, right? And do you want to limit it to
Yeah.
specifically that scope? And the second part to that, which I think your point is very valid, is, perhaps what we talked about internally at the last minute was perhaps we don't list some of those examples in the other sections and just reference the term minor structures and leave the definition. Because there's a couple places where we still say minor structures such as, when it's not part of the definition, it's part of the regulatory code. So maybe we just take those terms out that are underneath the minor structures. But yeah, that's why this was defined 3 different ways, and that was part of the trouble.
yes, it is.
Yep.
Yeah.
So for example, if maybe what you're talking about is on page 11, under E4, we do reference a couple examples. I think if I'm correct, Sarah, most of that underlined was stuff that was somewhere else.
Yes.
Perhaps then the approach to what you're talking about for consistency is removing the "which may include" part, because we already define it and it's kind of open-ended on the definition as it is, so maybe we don't need to confuse that more by adding more example uses. Does that
Wouldn't a
make sense?
vendor booth be a minor structure? Like if a guy's selling parasailing,
It could be.
it's not on there.
Well, again,
That's-
the definition under, so we got two
That's
different,
what we're trying to
Yeah.
figure out.
There's two different
Do we want to
approaches.
list every possible thing that could be a minor structure, or do we rather want to define what a minor structure actually is?
and it's hard to define that exactly. The moment, like you're talking about, the moment you say, these are the types of uses, someone's
Well,
going to come up with three or
I think
four.
when you start having examples and then your example isn't in there, then people freak out and
Right.
they go, well, what about this? So it maybe have an,
Yeah, I think if you're going to have a definition, you ought to try and include all of them, like what you did. And then in the sections that are dealing specifically with minor structures, you can limit, the ones that are relevant to that particular section, but.
Because, yeah, I agree, because I immediately wrote in here, is this trying to remove jet ski areas? And immediately, that's what came to mind since it wasn't listed.
So you'd like me to include every possible thing that could be a minor structure,
Well,
or you'd rather me define what a minor
doesn't-
structure might include?
Well, if a minor structure doesn't include that, then it probably isn't a minor structure and shouldn't be there, in my opinion.
Our concern is
What's a minor
how to cover everything that might be considered a minor structure and making sure that we list everything that someone might want to have as a minor structure.
The goal is to, I think the goal originally in this and combining this was to identify example things that we're all maybe all familiar with, and then they all have somewhat similar characteristics, right? Instead of a comprehensive list of every type of thing that you could have on the beach potentially. That was the issue that we stopped at that point, right? So I think the bigger point that we're addressing is in sections where we're using the term minor structure, not listing other example types of minor structures under it, which may confuse the definition. That's one step that I think Mr. Hughes was pointing out. So like again, going back to page 11, perhaps we don't list those example uses under E4 and leave it for the definition. Maybe those uses need to be moved over to example structures under the definition, and that's fine, but two different issues, I think. But
Can we add maybe a sentence to the end of minor structures that is a little bit more encompassing, maybe, that gives a little bit of open definition there, so if a vendor does show up or something we haven't
Well, it
thought
does say
of?
including but not limited to, which gets you away from the Latin doctrine of inclusio unius est exclusio alterius,
There you go.
Hey,
which,
I want to see that typed out.
which means that if you include some things, you exclude others. And that's a doctrine of statutory construction, but you overcome that doctrine by saying including but not limited to. If you just gave a listing of things and you don't include something, it could be argued the doctrine of exclusio unius, that it excludes. To include one is to exclude the others.
Well, I guess in the conversation about the jet ski issue, it could be covered in D, Part 6, and accessories to a resort, because they have to all have a 50-room or larger spot. But then what is concerning to me is that we add in lifeguard support stands, which we don't have, which makes me curious, why we would add that and not put things we really have.
that was because, again, that was in there. That
Oh,
was
it
just
was.
in a different spot. And that's what Sarah's talking about, is we had basically the term minor structures, what was the other one? The occasional minor structures, and then something else, and they all three had different examples. So that was the debate, was do we start removing things, or do we just kind of try to compile everything that's already listed in here, and then that's our starting point. So I think that's part of the question to you all is, if you see things that shouldn't be in there, such as a lifeguard stand or something like that, then we can remove that. But again, you might have a pool at a condo or at a hotel that maybe they have to have a lifeguard stand that might be in there. That could be a circumstance where that's needed.
One other question. D1, boating with no motors permitted except electric trolling motors. Where is that area? That would be where, I understand there's, the whole area along the beach, which is swimming, but you're not going to get boats to take their motors off to park their boat in front of the Lani Kai.
I think what we're talking about here is kayaking and small fishing boats, potentially in the critical wildlife area. Paddleboarding, kayaks, small boats. We're not talking about allowing people to, yeah, you can dock there, like if you will need to pull your boat in, but I don't think that that's an activity we want to encourage in that area.
There's also an ordinance which prohibits motorized vehicles 500 feet, is it 500? Which, when I was in office, we put into effect. Those little white buoys all along the
So right
island.
now, if you have a Hobie Cat, you can't pull it up in front of your house?
It's non-motorized.
Yeah.
Motorized.
Okay,
It's
you
not
can.
motorized, you can.
Okay. Oh,
Okay.
sorry.
No, you're fine.
Are we going to go through this, like, because I haven't,
I mean, we
a
can if
number
you
of-
want to go for, let's go.
And that's part of the reason why we left this on here alone, because we really wanted to get it right and at least
Well,
move
let's make
forward
sure
and
we
get
go
your input.
through it. But I wanted to get everyone's comments first because we all read through it and had questions. Let's start with the 34-652, page 1. Is there, as we read through this, is there any changes, anything that's ambiguous, anything you'd like hardened?
C, accretion. I don't have a problem with it except by the reference to, by adding permitted in, it includes artificial filling. That could be read to include the fact that you are permitting artificial filling, the way it's been amended here. And I don't know what that was the intent. When you change the language from automatic to be assigned to be permitted in, what was the reasoning on changing that? I don't quite follow that.
The language was somewhat ambiguous, and I wanted to point out that it is a permitted use there. You can get a permit to do filling in that area.
But if it's in the EC zone and on the sand, what are you going to be putting there that's not sand?
Beach renourishment. This allows beach renourishment.
But wouldn't you renourish the beach with sand and natural
Sand.
materials?
Yes, yes.
So not artificial filling.
Well, it is artificial. You're bringing in fill.
Right, so you got the natural and then the not natural, right? And so it occurred to us reading this that you technically can't do beach renourishment in the EC by the way this was written before.
So anything
Or
that we
to make
bring
it
in-
more clear
any
that
sand
that's
that we bring
obviously-
in is artificial at that point.
Because it's coming from
From
someplace else out in the water, but it's still the same sand.
Yes, it's not occurring naturally. There are requirements for the types of fill that you bring in, but once it's a man-made project, we would consider that artificial.
So is there a definition, a very limited definition of what we consider artificial fill for the beach?
We can include that.
I think we oughta.
We ought to. I see trucks coming
Yeah,
down
I
Estero
don't-
Boulevard now.
I don't,
Here comes the rocks.
I think somehow you don't want to get the impression that a private property owner can add fill, When you're talking about artificial, that's done on a governmental-wide basis. But with the approval of property owners, but.
But can they
We-
really
we
say
can't-
no on a beach replenishment when it's,
Yes, they can. As we know, it was done with what is now the Sunset. They refused it, and so it became a lake and a moss pit, and then it got filled in naturally. Took
Okay.
about 3 or 4 years, 3 years. Disgusting.
Okay,
I have. When you go back and you look at the purpose in 652 under A, you give two areas as far as designated beaches and significant wetlands. When we're talking about beach renourishment, it's typically just dealing with the designated beaches. Is there artificial feel for the significant wetlands that's approved? Because it's not being addressed. And
That-
we're
that
trying
may
to look at
be-
one thing here to say, okay, this covers everything, but is there a way to fill
would-
in significant wetlands?
It would have to go through any sort of permitting process, which means it would have to go to DEP, it would have to go through the appropriate permitting processes. So if it was found to be needed, necessary, important, and meet all of the requirements of the state, potentially, I don't think that's typically something we would encourage. And most of the wetlands are on property that are not individually owned. So that wouldn't be something that an individual property owner would be able to come in and request.
Same thing would hold true for the one item in D that is not covered under A as far as critical wildlife habitat?
Are you, under D, are you talking about?
Under D, it says permitted uses of structures, and you give
Oh,
three
okay.
areas where it's permitted. Wetlands, beaches, or critical wildlife habitats. But yet in the purpose under A, you only cover two of them.
wetlands and beaches.
We can include that in the purpose. It was not previously included. If you feel that would be appropriate, we can do that.
If we're going to talk all three of them in D, I think we need to reference all of them under purpose for A.
Trying to think of, I understand your point. The, I don't want to say counter argument, but the devil's advocate on that is, you're right. I mean, we're talking about the same EC district, so it's, I was trying to think of a way where critical habitat that's outside of the EC then could get claimed to be EC
There
district.
isn't any?
But that's handled differently. So what I don't want to do is confuse about a land grab or some other type, right? Because the reality is, as the beach moves, the EC line should be moving and matching it. We don't necessarily want to do, excuse me, the same thing with a critical wildlife habitat. You might have upland wildlife habitat that doesn't need to be EC, but this wouldn't really apply to that anyway, because the whole section is about the EC district, so. I'm just trying to think in my head of the downside or then the positives and the
Well,
negative side.
In any of this language that we use, excuse me, when you're covering purpose and you list the two items up there, and which again is listed in number 1 and number 2, but then you go further down under that same code and you list a third that's not addressed anywhere, it's very ambiguous as far as what we're supposed to do with it.
Fair enough, yes.
Under D4, in removing hiking or nature studies, including pedestrian boardwalks and dune crossovers, I'm not quite sure where the boardwalks and dune crossover have to do anything with hiking or nature studies in these areas, but why are we taking that out? Because don't we have, wouldn't that be considered that boardwalk that goes all the way through Bay Oaks area behind Bay Oaks? That's got boardwalks and,
Essentially, that removes it from a permitted use, and it's allowed as a special exception use, like most of your other, I guess I'd say, more impactful structures.
was that listed someplace else?
It wouldn't be in the EC zone though, would it?
Yeah, so in the EC,
Oh,
under, where'd it go? E, if you go to the next page on
Would-
packet page 11,
Would that be considered like across from Bermuda Dunes, that bird sanctuary that's there, that people walk around all the time?
technically a dune walkover has to go over a dune, right? That's
Okay,
the
so
first part.
you're saying they have to have a
All it does is-
boardwalk or a dune crossover to prohibit hiking or nature studies.
All it does is it changes the dune walkover in that section from a permitted use automatically to a special exception use. So if you go to page 11 on E, stop me if I misspoke, Sarah, but 6 was added.
I think what she's actually asking is why are we taking out hiking or nature study? Is that part of what
Right,
you're asking?
right.
Okay, because it's included as a recreation activity.
Yes, it's included in another place.
That's what I was asking, is it
Yeah.
included someplace else?
Yes, it's a recreation activity.
And let me
It's
see if
passive
it's-
recreation.
Another question about especially those two, which confused me. In number 4, you're taking out hiking, which is an activity, and nature study, which is outdoor education, but yet in 5, you're adding, or still is outdoor education, and a little further down, you go into recreation. Are we trying to define nature study as non-educational?
No, it was part of the repetitiveness of this section.
Not really taking out nature study, we're just going to conclude that it is part of the outdoor education.
Yes, it was part of, they were
Okay.
calling out sort of random options of things that you could do there when we could handle that all under recreation activities.
Where did you say hiking was put back in?
It wasn't put back in, it's a recreation activity, and then we included a definition for recreation.
All right, I'll look there.
New 5, that's below it.
Just one more typo thing. On page 10, number B, first line, intent, the application of the EC district is intended to prevent a public harm. It should just be public harm.
Okay. Thank you.
Are we on 5?
Yes, we're moving down.
I would strike by starting out recreation activities, and then it goes down with these activities and uses include. I would strike that language, just start with passive recreation, but a more general thought here was that is to consider 5 and 9 to be combined, because they both deal with temporary structures. You've added temporary in 5, and then you've got 9 is temporary. And I just wondered if you might want to consider trying to have that all together, or at least several paragraphs under the same heading.
The
of
difference?
Have recreational activities also included under temporary structures, because all of the recreation activities that you've now made them all temporary structures.
The difference between those two sections is recreation activities and then temporary movable minor structures on private property. That's the key component there.
All right, that raises another question for me. What about temporary on public property? That you'd say so you're saying that 5 applies to public property and 9 to private property?
Yes.
I think we ought to say that then. That would help.
It does say that
Where's that?
on number 9, temporary movable and minor structures on private property are
Yeah, but
permitted
it
by
does.
right.
It doesn't make any distinction in 5 as to whether it's
Yeah.
private or
Okay.
public. I'm done with that one.
Shall we move to 6?
Back to 5, I've got
Okay.
a question there, because, and again, going with what he's talking about between 5 and 9. Private property temporary structures, you talk about artificial lighting, but in section 5, you're removing that whole sentence. Is there not artificial lighting permitted?
Yes, that's correct.
A temporary structure? There wouldn't be any artificial lighting available?
You're saying, any temporary structure used in
It-
conjunction with
it's-
such uses must comply with all provisions, then you remove the sentence dealing with artificial lighting. But a little bit further down under the private property, you're saying, no, you can have it, but you got to go with a permit.
So when you read through that entire thing, it says approved by special exception. It says it may not be installed unless by a special exception. So we moved that down to the section that has to do with special exceptions. That section, number 5, included a lot of different information that wasn't necessarily compatible, and that was part of what we were trying to change, is you had to read through that entire thing to understand what was a special exception and what wasn't. So we moved that specific information to special exception.
5.
Right, so remember, when we started the conversation, and I get that's part of the challenge of this puzzle, is piecemealed throughout where you're in a section talking about permitted uses, and then they would throw in a couple references to special exceptions. So we're trying to be a little bit more consistent, at least, and that should be listed under the special exception section, as opposed to being somewhere else. So maybe we didn't accomplish 100%. We're trying to separate and bifurcate, I guess, these sections of dealing with a common topic. So D, and what we're talking about, should be mostly dealing with permitted uses. And then E will deal with special exception uses. That's the goal anyway, is to make it easier to find where things are and what's required. So it was a special exception before, and it's proposed as a special exception. It's just in a different place.
On 6, accessory to a resort, is resort defined in the definition section?
Yes, I believe that it is. I didn't include it in the new definition, so that makes me think, but I will double check.
Well, I think it it should be, because I think a lot of people could define resort in many different ways.
I'm pretty sure it
as
has
to
a
what is
definition.
a resort and what isn't a resort.
I'm confident there's a definition there because we go through this all the time when we talk about beach chairs and other uses.
Yeah.
And there is a pretty well-defined definition in there. For
Okay.
both, for the resort and the multifamily thing. That
7? 8. 9?
9.
And can we stop for a second? In
Yeah.
8, we left 8 alone, but I know there's enough history on the beach where that may or may not have been a challenging question. So if you can think of examples that maybe that might be an issue, let me know. But I think that was put in, I'm trying to remember the example of it, but
Wasn't there an example of the cottage trying to, not the cottage, what was the?
so I think the conversation has
Shuckers
been
restaurant trying to move
expansion
in?
versus new. Whereas this code allows an expansion of an existing. So if you had something that was existing, a COP that was existing prior to the town incorporating, something could be expanded, whereas if it wasn't there and they try to add it, it can't be. So that's the key part of here, is the expansion part of it is permitted. And I
The
think-
old Shuckers, what was Shuckers before? Gulf Shore. Didn't they try to put outdoor alcohol use right in front of it on the beach at one point? I thought we stopped that was this used? If he was looking for an example.
There's some contentious issues between whether something was existing or not existing, I think is what the issue is. So because this allows expanded of an existing, in theory, you're supposed to document that, yes, this is an ongoing legal use that's been there, versus somebody coming in with a new application, which would have to go through a special exception process. So if it's still, I mean, my point is, if expanding of an existing use should be in a special exception, now's the time to move this over to the next page, essentially.
Thoughts on
I'd be
that?
okay with that.
Moving this
Not,
over
I'm
to
not
special
advocating for either
exception?
way, I'm just wanted to point it out that it's left alone, but it may be something with your all experience, a little bit better knowledge than ours of whether those are contentious issues or problems or what have you.
I guess the bigger thing, this would be more for Times Square area and the restaurants on the beach right there. And maybe one or two other examples of beachside. Which would be, what, Pinchers at the Wyndham. So, I mean, what's the thoughts on this? Do we want to move it to a special exception? Or is it going to be a, want to leave it here? Any thoughts on the
More
change?
It'd be more restrictive moving it to special exceptions. I think I'm in favor of that.
Either way, they have to come before.
In order to get a COP, I mean, they have to go through the process, but this would be expansion of an existing COP.
It wouldn't be a new COP.
It's listed as a permitted use.
What?
right?
So right now, it's a permitted use as an expansion. If we move it to special exceptions, then it becomes into, they have to come in front. They have to go through the legislative process. I am for moving it, giving it a second, that way it gets a second look as to what's going on here. Anybody else thoughts?
I don't know. I mean, there's, to become designated for consumption and service, you're going through you jump a lot of hoops in the first place. I
They've
would-
already done that. This is
Yeah.
just an expansion of it.
Right.
But we've already identified their space that they can have at this juncture. It's already maxed out, isn't that correct?
Well, I don't know about max out. You would have an existing business that's been there for 35 years that has an area that's been defined in theory, and then the expansion of that area is a permitted use versus same business that doesn't have the outdoor area, comes in and wants a new one, has to go through a special exception. That's the difference. It's just, there's less oversight, I guess I would say, on the existing business. It's giving the existing business a benefit that they've been there, so go ahead and expand to whatever, maybe they weren't expanded to the max allowed by the
I
code right
agree
now.
with that. Business owners are tired of jumping through hoops, and you just want to make another hoop to jump through, in my honest opinion.
I can think of that are on the sand already have outdoor
on,
use, and that was defined by the water, mean tide water back to this, and I can't imagine that anybody didn't take the space that they were allotted.
And this very well may only benefit one or two, I don't know. It's just, that's why I brought the topic up.
Are we in favor of leaving it where it is, guys? I mean, just a kind of a head nod on this? Leave it where it is.
Your discussion will be highlighted at the next step.
I'm sure it will. And that's okay.
There's your 2 hours back there, just for your thought process. Note that.
Sorry to interrupt, go on, sorry.
Number 9, which, any more talk about?
Well, there again, you see, there's a reference down there to recreational equipment, then it says C-34-652. That's a holdover, the reference to that section is a holdover from the same language that was in 366. So that just failed to get stricken. So I would strike C-34-652 because that's the section we're already in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay?
And it also
And
brings up.
that ties up, that kind of ties 5 and 9 together, which is what I was talking about before.
So would you eliminate that whole, well, the artificial lighting is covered in another area, so would you just shorten that to, is it needed there?
Are we, okay, what was the consensus? Are we pulling out the examples of uses?
Yes.
So that pretty much strikes that examples. Recreation, see, I mean, almost pulls out everything in the parentheses. If you strike that out too as well.
Break out the underline, yes.
Break out, I mean, I don't see the reason for that whole temporary movable. Oh, on
Structures of
private property,
are
okay.
permitted by right in the EC zone district if they do not alter the natural landscape or obstruct pedestrian traffic,
Period.
period. And then artificial lighting and signs may not be installed in EC zone district unless approved by special exception.
And that's
that-
already written in the artificial lighting, so.
Because that moves artificial lighting over to a special exception by that sentence. Creates the ability for special exception to be number 5.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I
think so,
think the
too.
only thing that I would keep in there is, it says unless explicitly permitted by 14.5/2751 of this LDC. So I'll probably say artificial lighting and signs
Well,
may not
from
be
that
approved.
point all the way through. From artificial signs, deviation in the plan development, and keep going. So we're just striking out that one line.
No, I thought from examples on through the end of the paragraph.
Well, we need artificial lighting and signs may not be installed to create
Why?
a special
Because it's
exception.
under artificial lighting over here under special exception.
Yeah, so to be consistent with what I said in the previous part is we can strike artificial lighting from this subsection because we list it as a special exception
Okay.
use. The question is the relationship to the second part of the, or the last part of that sentence, I guess, what Sarah was talking about is the,
14.5 or 2751 of this LDC. So I think that has to do with.
Page 11.
Okay, so.
Yeah.
so that's kind of like a caveat, right? That's kind of one of
Yes.
the, so maybe we can word it better and, it's saying it's a special exception, right? But you already have it listed unless there's an exception to that. And the code's littered with those, so it's kind of one of those, there's 2 other sections we need to worry about.
I think maybe you could expand on the artificial lighting in E5 to better explain artificial lighting, as opposed to having it be in the paragraphs.
Well, signage isn't listed as a special exception here, but signage is part of that sentence there.
I agree with the chairman here. I don't think it, I really think it would be better to take artificial lighting out of that section there.
Right, so the other part of that is I guess it directs you to the if you did a CPD, but there's 2 parts of that. First, you'd be rezoning, so it's a whole different thing. It's no longer the EC, so that would help, and then it helps be consistent with what we're trying to say in all of this, which is if you're going to assign a use or assign a level of review for a use, address it in that section. So I think we can probably look at removing those section references and what you said, the artificial lighting down.
So do we need to add to E, number 7, signs? Because that is in that temporary movable 9. It says artificial lighting and signs, so do we need to identify signs?
That seems reasonable.
Okay.
And there's something on the numbering and lettering here that's when it got carried over from 366 on the next page, it doesn't, you go from 9 A and then A2. There's
Yeah,
no
where's
1. There's something
Should A
got to
be
be
1?
changed around there to have the lettering and numbering right.
Yes, I'll correct that. Thank you.
Because
Maybe it's
in the old 366, there was, if you look at that, that was a total, that was a separate section. There was A, B, and C, and now you've got just A, 1, and 2.
I'll correct that. Thank you.
And in
Good?
yeah, that was my
Okay.
comment on that.
So we're on
yeah.
page 11 now. Okay.
Well, actually, 2. Back to 9, as far as a couple housekeeping items, and I agree with the coding on where number 1 is, but also in the first sentence, temporary movable and minor structures. I believe "and" should be removed.
So it addressed
minor
two different
structures.
things, and that's the struggle with when we say minor structures. Some things are not a structure.
I don't think you would use an "and" in between them.
The "and" was to extend to the occasional, and it just wasn't taken out there.
Yes.
Would it be an
Also-
or?
Yeah.
No, because temporary movable minor structures, they took out occasional, so you take out the "and" because the "and" included occasional.
Actually, the intent was that these would be temporary or movable and minor.
So it had to be, okay.
So,
So
minor
that would
structure-
be a
It's a
a
two-
table, not a permanent structure that you would move, something that was very small and minor, an umbrella.
Flagpole.
Yeah, something that you could put in the ground and then pull back out. So it was temporary, it was minor, it was movable.
trying not to limit some of the uses on private property, but at the same time, make it aware that some things do need extra permitting, so,
Yes, this wouldn't apply to like if you wanted to install a seawall. That might be minor, but that's not movable or temporary.
Okay.
and then again, the term structures gets redefined depending on what type of code you're looking at. If you're talking about building code, if you're talking about comprehensive plans, if you're talking about LDCs, which section you're talking about, so it's confusing.
Well, I think what's confusing is the minor structure piece here is temporary and movable minor structure when we've been talking about a definition of minor structures that includes parking areas and shuffleboard courts and things of that sort. So it's kind of,
Yeah, so
Yeah.
the intent is that all of those have to apply. It has to be minor, it has to be temporary, it has to be movable. So if all of those things apply, you can have that on your private property within the EC zoning district.
clear up the mud.
And I'd say temporary, and take a slash out of the temporary, if those are all requirements, temporary, comma, movable, and minor.
Okay.
Juan, do you have a second?
So in 9, if reading this correctly, number 9 really deals with things on private property. But when you come over here to A, is there a need to have it listed again as private property? Being 9 is the main heading of private property?
I had included that again, sort of as a reminder in case anybody had missed it on the first one. I can remove it.
Tendency to me, but
Struggle is sometimes people don't pay attention to the construct of the section or subsection you're in, and so it's a bad habit, but we do that sometimes it's guilty of what we're trying to change. I understand that. We get
why
that.
we're bringing it up and
Yes,
talking
we
about it
understand.
now.
It's a lesser version of it, but it's still guilty of the same thing. I understand.
On private properties, out.
A.
An A. All right, so we're back on page 11, A1 and 2. Anything else in there? All right, let's go for special exception use and structures. E. I had one on number 4, should be located as close to landward edge. Define close to, as close to, because that is very open to interpretation.
And I feel like that's part of why this was included in the other section, and that's part of the reason why we wanted it to be part of the special exception process, because it's hard to define exactly what you mean by that, and one person's definition of what close to and another person's is very different. So that would have to be something that would be addressed through that special exception process, because I don't think staff's really comfortable saying within 5 feet, within 2 feet, because it is dependent on the project.
There's no other way to kind of give some guidance here.
You can, but there's, in my opinion, there's two ways to do it, right? There's give guidance, but then with the allowance to change that through that public process, or there's to leave it open-ended and let the public process define it. Is that unfair or fair to both sides? Probably. Because if you define it and you set it, then it doesn't matter what happens at the public process, they've got to meet that. Right, so
I
that's
think
the
that's really-
downside to it, or the upside, depending on what the project is. This, I think, I
'Cause
look
there
at these
are-
as one of those, it gives you the opportunity to determine it whatever you want to at the time.
I'm just more concerned if somebody's gonna come in front and say, hey, I want a shuffleboard court, and I'm gonna put it right at the edge of the line, and it's, halfway out the beach, and, that's, because I hate to be this way, but, people are going to do as they do. So that's why I'm trying to,
Well,
what can we do for guidance to kind of harden this a little bit, if anything?
Right,
You
and on the
still have
flip
to get a
side,
special exception to
right,
do
and
that.
I was gonna say, on the flip side, someone could say, I'm gonna be 5 feet, and you and the council could say, well, we really want it at 1 foot or 2 foot, you know what I mean? So it can work the other way too, where if you really want to turn down a project, this gives the flexibility to turn that down. If you really want to approve a project, it gives the flexibility to do that. If you don't want that flexibility, that's where you would further define what we mean. But that's a hard thing to define within proximity. So I don't know enough about the distance.
I don't, and it's gonna be different for every property, it's going to be different every place you go,
And that's why it's hard to put a,
yeah.
Yeah,
2
because
foot.
we have sections of huge expanses of beach and then very narrow pieces, so it was hard to.
Not only do I want a shuffleboard, I want to put, stadium seating next to it too. It's temporary and it's movable.
And so,
Just saying.
and that's why we kind of left that alone for this discussion, and partly also because, again, there's so many different types of uses that we're talking about and structures that we're talking about. It was hard to do. A
I can live with
gazebo
that.
versus a patio versus whatever is completely different.
Yes, we're still on E.
Yep.
In the precatory language there, the introductory paragraph, these special exceptions are permitted according to special exceptions, which would deal, if somebody just wants to have a special exception dealing with that particular item or structure or something. But how about the fact that this may come up in the context of a planned development? And shouldn't that also say that as a special exception or as a deviation in a planned
So that's what we were talking about a little bit earlier.
development?
I think we're trying to move in the direction of not trying to address every scenario in every section, because we have a rezoning, we have a deviations, we have a plan development section that addresses that. So if you're doing that, it's a different process and a different section of the code.
Well, I understand that, but what if somebody has a planned development and something comes up in their planned development that they want to do?
And
that
none of this
falls in-
applies because it won't be EC. They're asking for a different zoning district. That's the kind of approach and thought that we're taking. So this is in the EC district, right? You've got zoning as is. If I'm trying to rezone, then there's a different process and it's a different district technically that I'm asking. And by our code, you can ask for whatever you want. I think we look back at this section and say, would we allow that normally in the EC, or what kind of standards are we looking for? But the criteria for deviations to a CPD is completely different. So that's why we're trying, I think that goes back to the theme of trying to let the zoning process that's spelled out in the uses that you can ask for and how you measure that when you're reviewing it, let that be dealt with in that section, and not keep referring to those things.
That's why in the old section 366, it did include on minor structures in either special exception or deviations. But you've eliminated that in 4.
Right, because your deviations would only be under would be under a rezoning, which then it would be a CPD or an RPD zoning district and a different process. That's the struggle we had, is you're in the EC district section, right? We're talking about the actual zoning district and the
Right.
uses and the processes by which those uses
Yes.
can be reviewed.
There was some of the Torgerson property was in the EC district. Remember the little piece at the bottom there?
Right, and we
Okay.
had that conversation about leaving it out of CPD and leaving it in the EC so that we wouldn't so we could address it through this section, whereas if they had done it through the CPD, we would have reviewed and defined what they could do within that zoning, their zoning district. So now they're subject to this section because that portion of their property has not been rezoned to CPD. It is within their master concept plan boundary, but it is not part of their CPD zoning district. That makes sense?
Okay.
Because if you go through a CPD, right, you've got to define the uses, you got to define the criteria, you've got to say, this is why it meets these things, A, B, and C. And technically through a CPD, you can ask, or an RPD, you can ask for anything. So they have EC, they have to abide by these regulations according to that section, this section.
So if somebody, in a Torgerson situation, if they wanted to do something in part of their CPD, but it fell within this special exception, they would have to, which section are they dealing with then?
And the portion that is EC of their property has to meet this EC section. The rest of their property is CPD. And if you remember, part of that was because we didn't want to get into the weeds of dealing with the waterfront stuff during that process. We're focused on the number of units and whether the thing was going to get approved or not, right? So we left that for another day, subject to the EC regulations. The alternative is somebody comes along and rezones a portion of their property from EC to whatever zoning district. Then they have to abide by that zoning district regulations and uses, right? So under the Torgerson example, if they had chosen to ask for, instead of leaving it as EC and asking for the CPD to apply, then as part of that process, we would have had a condition and regulate the uses, location, how close is that, point a minute ago, how close is that to that line, where do they go, what do they look like, what type of uses, and how much impervious are they going to put. That would have been part of their CPD review process. It would not have been regulated under the EC district. You might have referred back to this section for examples of what we normally would do, but it's still it's a separate review, and it's got different criteria, right? Your deviations have different criteria than your special exception.
Well, I understand that. I just wonder whether it might create some conflict between when somebody's coming in on a CPD, but then there's something that they're asking for that falls within the special exception provision.
It wouldn't.
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't need a special exception, because they're asking for it as part of the rezoning. Right, so once it's left as EC and still within their boundary.
This section says that unless it's granted a special exception, it's not permitted in an EC zone.
That's right. So the moment you ask for a different zoning district, it's a different ballgame. And the CPD is a zoning district, so that's.
It'll move out of EC and into whatever zoning district that they're rezoning to.
We typically,
CPD can include an EC, part of an EC.
But they've separated it.
but it changes from EC to CPD, right? So what we traditionally do in the town is, I change to a CPD, but I'm going to use whatever zoning district standards as my base, okay? But downtown zoning district. If you're going to, Torgerson's base for his zoning district is whatever's in the downtown. That's just for an easier reference to go back and go, instead of us relisting all that stuff and redefining all that, we can go back to that downtown and go, 90% of this applies. The same thing would happen under a CPD example that you're given. If I'm rezoning from EC to CPD, I've got to define the uses, where they're going to be. I got to have a site plan to show how my development in that area is going to be, and it would be subject to the conditions of approval for that CPD district. It would move from EC to CPD. And then you might condition certain things later on, have to have additional special exceptions. You could do that, but that just gets it convoluted. Does that make sense?
Give up.
I understand what you're saying. This is for EC only. If you're CPD, it's a different zoning district, different criteria.
Okay.
Only because there is a CPD that hasn't been built yet and has pulled the EC section of that development out. Are any of the changes in this document, knowing what's on their documents, affecting anything for or against what is being asked? Yeah.
I would say no. I don't see. I can't think of a reason why it would conflict. the part of the agreement is we're not going to ask for a whole bunch of other stuff in the EC as part of in our boundary and leave it till later. That may affect that, but most of what they talked about required a special exception anyways. I can't think of, I mean, they were really talking about alcohol, consumption of alcohol on the beach and related to the pool and all that. So I can't think of anything else that this would change on their, they're not going to do a dune walkover, I don't think. I don't think there's a dune there, so. I'm pretty sure everything that they would have tried to do is subject to a special exception anyways. I don't think this changes anything as far as use or
not
path
even,
for them.
not even just TPI. Anybody else that's in any kind of planning at this point that you know of, that these changes would affect what they have in the process?
I can't answer that directly. I mean, I can't think of anything that somebody's got in that.
So nothing in this book was prompted by somebody asking for it, or against it, or to stop it. Honestly,
Well, no,
there's something.
There's many avenues of input.
I'm just trying to think of the answer. I think it's experience. I think is, yes, there's changes here and part of them are directed by experience with previous projects. I can put it that way. And I can't think of anything that's in an application now that would be changed. And anything that has an application in right now would be subject to the rules under which that application is. So it wouldn't affect them either way. If I have an application in for development, I'm subject to the rules that are in place at that time. You can't change. We can't change the rules on them at the 12th hour, 11th hour, 12th hour, whatever the phrase is. You know, they can't get 90% done, and they can't get 20% done, and then change the rules on them. They're subject to.
Well, we have done that before.
Well, in my opinion, they're subject to what was in place exactly when they submitted a complete application.
I just hate not knowing what
unintended consequences are.
unintended, that, and the fact that sometimes these things are directed by, you know, not really planners. And then they have serious conflicts because they aren't really real. It's just someone directing.
You want to address that?
I would say in most localities, these are items that are already required. In other localities with these EC districts, this is the process. It does go through a special exception, and that gives the land develop or the LPA and the council the opportunity to make sure that this makes sense, it's reasonable, and it doesn't leave it at the feelings of staff and regulations that aren't clear.
I'm all for guidelines and definitions, but I am not, I mean, there's several places in here that by right has been taken out. And I am 100% private property owners supporter, so I have a problem when I'm not quite sure where this direction is coming from, who we're affecting or how we're affecting. And I'm just wondering if when you're researching our new plan and our revisions from here to here, are you seeing anything that pops out that's different?
Well, I think that we included minor structures in the special exceptions, which does add an extra layer of review. It isn't an administrative review anymore. But like I said, when I was asked to put this together, this is very similar to other communities. This isn't above and beyond. This is a pretty typical way to do these reviews.
To answer your question directly, if you look at the permitted list, it's pretty clear if you look at what's being stricken from that. I mean, essentially the dune walkovers is the biggest thing that is being changed, but it really wasn't, it's not that much different. There was some vagueness, there's some conflict in the code. Some of them were special exceptions as it was. I think this is really clearing that up. And yes, to the side of clearly being a special exception without having the opportunity to be a permitted use. To answer you directly, that's kind of, I think, the biggest, I wouldn't say biggest, but the biggest change of clarity that's being offered in this. And it is an example of one that's going through. The county is going through a process now. They're trying to modify and rebuild their dune walkovers and their access to the beach. We told them it had to be a special exception process. And so then, and they don't have their application in yet, but they wouldn't be affected by this because they were already directed to do a special exception.
If I hear you right, what you're asking is, have we limited any private property rights or use rights by doing
Or
this?
by
that
right.
Any more than what is already currently in the code, was already currently on these codes, is what she's asking.
And I
mean,
think our opinion is there was some vagueness about some of the processes, and this further defines what we believe the interpretation of that process was and makes it more clear. That's really what the intent is. So did something specifically go from permitted to special exception? No. I think there was debate over whether the code actually said which time and version is something a special exception versus a permitted use, and we're trying to make it more clear when it is a special exception, where there was vagueness maybe or confusion or conflict internal to the code. So no, I don't believe we took anything specific and said, you used to be able to do this, you can no longer do that right.
But you have taken it from by right to now a special exception.
Which ones?
Well, like E1, and I have another one.
But even by making it a special exception, they're not taking it away as much as it has a different, more, it's getting a second look before it's a
Another layer of
permanent-
government.
But
Permanent
let's talk about
use.
one, because that's a great point, is essentially what it said is you could do an accessory structure, including building structure, impervious surface, which is accessory to a use permitted by right or by a special exception. So what that means is somebody could come through you and go through the council, get a special exception, show you what they're doing, and then turn around and come back and as a right, get an accessory use or structure to that they didn't tell you about during that process. Which would be basically they could tell you half the story. Because you are allowing an accessory structure, right? So we struck the by right part, right?
Yes.
And now it's only for a special exception. So right now, it's only as a special exception. They could basically, or structures that were permitted before, they could do an accessory structure to it. So that's, am I saying that right, Sarah, or did I confuse it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, because that was saying basically if you had, if you got a house permitted there, then you could build a pool in the EC because that is accessory to that structure. So what we're saying is it's now permitted by special exception. You can't just get it by right.
See.
Yes.
Should there still be a
Environmentally
reference to,
critical area.
oh, excuse me. Should there still be a reference there to section 6-366? Because you really moved all that into this section, haven't you not? Have you not?
Let me double check.
And to answer your question, Ms. Plummer, I think it's the D section is the 3652D is the part you want to focus on. If you think there's something in there that's being removed was critical before allowed, then we can discuss that. I don't think there is. I think it's just trying to clean it up.
Mr. Hughes, I think
yeah,
you
my-
are.
Your answer, Mr. Hughes.
I think you are correct.
In one,
I'm sorry.
if I may, or by special exceptions, it says, when it says C6366.
Yes, I heard you. Yeah, I removed that. That doesn't make
That,
sense.
yeah, we should
Yes,
eliminate.
because we pulled it out of there.
Yeah, okay.
That's correct.
Dan, do you want to take another swipe at E? I want you satisfied with E before we move on. I
That
mean,
was my issue there, that just a minor thing there.
Did
Take
you
another
get your
swipe.
answer?
Yeah.
I mean, dune walkover is the biggest one affected. That's
Okay.
that's the straight answer.
We've talked about the conflict between, again, minor structures, limitation, quasi-defined there in 4 as being not really consistent with on page 10 and page 16, but we've talked about that. They're going to look at that.
Jason, did staff had anything else to add to that? And I know it's a sidebar, I just wonder if there's something else that need to be added to
No,
this.
I mean, to answer Ms. Plum's question, I think the dune walkover is probably the biggest item on that list that is, I don't want to say moved, but moved. But again, it's,
I just wondered if Roger had something to add to this.
No.
Okay.
thank you.
All right, so are we satisfied with E? Dan, are you still concerned about the introductory period, the special exception in CPT versus,
No, I'm not.
are you sure? Okay.
No, I'm not. But I think you made my point. I got to think about it some more, and yeah.
I think it's a valid question, and I think it's part of the overall discussion of how do we modify these sections.
Right.
And so moving forward, I would like you, yes, think about that, and let's further that discussion, because if we don't want to do that, then we change the way we rewrite some of these sections. But that is part of the land development code. This entire land development code is littered with sections referencing other things that really had nothing to do with it, as a just in case. And so we're trying to eliminate that, but if we want to do those cross references, then we need to know that. So yes, I encourage us to continue that discussion, even if individually we want to sit down.
I'm just trying to conceive of a hypothetical situation which somebody wants to do something in connection with a plan development, but it could be permitted. I mean, there's a provision in the plan development to deal with those things, but there's this other section that says it can only be approved by a special exception, and so that because that.
In the EC district, correct. In the EC district.
In the EC district.
Right. So
Okay.
I think your scenario, I don't want to beat the dead horse, but I think it's a great point that your scenario is, using TPI again as an example, they had a boundary that was left as EC.
Right.
And they went through a master concept plan
Right.
process. They could have chosen, I guess in theory, to ask for those special exception uses as part of their master concept plan. I think that would have been a legal discussion, I think, of whether they could do that or not, and then does that circumvent the special exception process? So what happened out of that is they basically agreed, and we all agreed, you're going to deal with that through the special exception process, instead of rezoning it, and instead of asking for those uses without a rezoning. I don't think you can, if it's, to your point, TPI, could they have asked for those uses in certain approvals without going through the special exception process? I would tell you, to your point, that says special exception, no, they can't.
It's a great,
It is.
yeah.
I mean, it's the same
And I
process.
don't know there's a way to specifically solve it, though.
I think that's why we were curious if there was,
I think the answer to me right now, without further, Jack kicking me or something, is if it says special exception in the EC, you got to do a special exception. You can't use another process to replace that, to circumvent that, right? That's the same process, the same number of hearings, but it's different. So, different criteria.
How about F? Additional regulations?
So there's where, get to your point, Ms.
Any
Plummer,
dune
is
walk-
the
this is a dune
changes.
walkovers.
And this was stuff that we pulled from.
Yes, and this was pulled from
The provisions, yeah.
6366.
So again, you had development standards or requirements in a different section than where they belonged. So these are just moved essentially from another section to be created as regulations that are applicable to certain uses. And these are the regulations that are, these ones just happen to be only to walkovers.
I mean, comments about F?
well, I kind of do.
Okay.
To me, I realize that this is a critical, sensitive area, but if you don't put it in concrete or encase it somehow, doesn't it become a flying object during a hurricane when the water moves it and makes it whatever?
Actually, well, that's the flood code.
Right, so this is, again, this is a language that was in there. That's always been applicable. It's just in a weird section. And to your point, I would say that the code basically defines, and flood regulations define it as kind of a, I forget what that word is, the intent is for it to basically break apart and fall apart and be temporary, really. And I think that's part of the point. We do that with fences in the V zone also. We limit how much concrete or limit how much embedded something is, because essentially what you want is you want structures to fail. You want them to fall apart and fail. You don't want them to become a barrier to debris and altering waves. So if you have a fixed structure that will stand the test of time, then the wave action actually gets moved and pushed somewhere else and potentially can affect somebody else. So we do the same thing with fences and any other individual structure that comes along. But again, that language is the same as it's been, and it's the same criteria that they've had to meet. Just, it was in a section that you had to check 3 or 4 different places to find it.
Else on F?
Question and consent. I'm surmising that all of this is going to be ADA compliant?
Not necessarily, because there's
no.
individual single family that.
This could be private property, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
If it is for public use,
Yep.
it is required to meet ADA requirements. But this allows private use also.
This isn't clarified. That's what was my only question.
So everyone comfortable with that, with those changes? Okay. Do we want to take a break before we tackle 366, or keep going? Because most of this is moved. All right.
I think 366, we don't really have to deal with, because what's left there is already there, and what's not there has been moved into what we've already discussed, has it not?
Right, so that was Sarah's point, was this section had the stuff you see left, which
Right.
is appropriate for it, and then had other things kind of piled in. So this is kind of the example of what we were trying to do, is narrow this back down to what its purpose is. If,
Okay.
that's what's left.
Is everyone satisfied with the changes that we've made to this and the discussion that we've had here today?
We're not done, though, are we?
No.
I mean, we're going beyond 366 now.
Yeah, we had 366. You said there wasn't much to talk, you didn't.
No, we got to discuss that, page
Yeah.
13.
Okay, so there was some confusion, because I was talking about 366 when I just had
Oh,
been
oh,
saying,
okay.
and you said we don't need to
Okay.
go. Okay. So let's move through 366. Section A, any comments? B was moved to 652.
B is the old 9, it goes, is the new 9, and 652, okay. So that's all been carried over. Yeah.
Old C, new B, when existing major structures. Section D was moved to 652. Page 14, letter C, old, new E, EC, whatever that is.
It's covered, that's
Covered.
covered. Yep.
Okay. Now we have 1575 for coastal zones. Section A, any comments, corrections, changes?
I think you answered a question here I had at the beginning, that in the EC zoning district, seaward of the 78 coastal construction line, there is nothing in the EC district that isn't seaward of it, is it? There, I mean,
Well, right now, no.
right,
But by the comprehensive plan and the land development code, we're supposed to go back and evaluate where the beach actually is through accretion and all those other things, and then redraw that line. I question whether the town will ever do that because we have a very easy to find line right now. Makes it difficult as it starts moving back and forth. But to protect the beach, we'll have to look at that. So to answer your question, yes, right now, as far as I know, it meets and matches the 78 line. (1978). We're probably 77 and I think recorded in 78. I don't know. I think that
Do you
the
mean the
date-
document that I was referring to earlier? I can't tell you off the top of my head. If you like, I can go find it.
No, I would like to get one next meeting.
Okay.
I just have there's been such controversy over whether the town had actual surveys, and we do actually have a survey.
There's a recorded survey of the 78 line in the Lee County Public Records, yes.
Yes, with an
About
official description.
1991.
That's a DEP line that's recorded. We don't use that as a regulatory tool. All we do is we use, not all, but for the most part, we use a 78 line as a boundary, as a surveyed boundary essentially to establish the EC zoning district. There's a couple other sprinkles in the code of where it refers to the 78 line, but most of it, I've tried to steer away from saying special exceptions for development seaward of the 78 line because it's really special exception for development in the EC zoning district. But the 78 line is defining that district.
That's it, is the issue in the litigation that put the stop order on the house, but the junk canoe, next to junk canoe there, that was a coastal construction line issue, was it not? In that litigation. The two homes that are sitting there that partly completed.
There's, in every case where you're talking about development, there's two things, right? There's part of it's the 78 line, but the majority of it, what I'll always recommend is you refer to it as the EC zoning district development standards. I know it's a small thing, but the reality is the zoning, well, you just went through it, right? We just went through the regulatory component of the EC. That's what's deciding which reviews get. It's not, there's no section of the code that says the 78 line blah, 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 blah. You got to use your zoning as your tool to regulate.
Comments? I want to discuss B that was struck out. And I believe that was for clarification because you've already defined it in other places.
Yeah, this was just minor structures that didn't fit here. This
Expendable.
is sort of a definition stuck in the middle of another section.
C and D should become B and C. There's no B.
The language that's struck in B, old B, is what I was trying to think of is the term expendable. That's the term that is really used when we're talking about not embedding concrete.
I see.
Over with the walkways, the walkovers, because that's really sounds to me like it should be over with that instead of here.
652-9.
Yeah, exactly.
And I
think that gives the justification behind it.
Yeah, and I think that we just wanted to, because this is just about coastal zones, so we just wanted to sort of include that this is how this needs to work, that people shouldn't be driving through this, and that if that's going to happen, it needs to be a different way. I mean, we can certainly move it if you guys don't think that it makes sense here.
So I looked at it as kind of loosely defining some of the things about the coastal zone, which is one, don't just drive through or blow through the dune, right? And then the second part to that is over in the sections that we've already talked about is we're kind of supporting this by defining when and where you do a dune walkover and how it's reviewed. So the dune walkover is the way to prevent you from doing that. But we want to be clear that no, you can't just traipse through. Because that's not a dune walkover. It's really just literally if you want to create a path through the dune or over a dune, on top of a dune, we want you to build something over it through the proper process. So. No, some of these sections we question whether we need them or not, but instead of, like this one, we already, we regulate and deal with a lot of this stuff, but at the same time, I didn't want to just eliminate something and somebody think that we don't care about the coastal zones, whatever that's defined as.
C, anyone? Have a comment, correction? Okay, moving on to the definitions to add to chapter 34.
Last line of minor structures,
Mm-hmm.
expendable under design wind. By wind, wave and storm.
Where are you?
The last line in.
16,
It's,
minor structures.
you're striking out B from the previous definition.
I think she's on page 16.
Yeah,
It's on page
It's-
16.
it's just moved.
Okay.
So minor structures do not include structures supported by extensions or principal structure. It shall be characteristic of minor structures that are considered expendable under design wind, wave, and storm forces. She's under
That's a-
design wind.
It's a,
Under design by wind,
Under,
wave and storm forces, or am I
all-
reading it wrong?
we call it design, it's kind of the engineering term that they use for the standards.
Yeah, that design wind
Design
level
st-
is, I think,
Okay.
180.
I know it sounds funny,
Instead
but
of
it's,
defining the
Yeah, gotcha.
wind, they define it by design.
Okay. All right.
I understand
Thank
your
you.
point. It's just quirky language when it's
Yeah.
technical stuff that's pulled from building code or something else.
Else on
And
this
it-
page? Oh, go ahead.
well, you know, in the second paragraph, on recreation, you know, include but not limited, you use that phrase. And then in the last paragraph, you do it by example. And I think we ought to be consistent and maybe say, you know, include but not limited to. I suppose one could argue that an example, by definition of the word example, is not a restrictive, limited word. It means it doesn't exclude everything, but
Exclude is-
it could be ambiguous. And
Limited to, but, wait.
it
not here.
could invoke the doctrine of inclusio unius, it's exclusio alterius.
I was going to say, to save you from the Latin again, we'll go ahead and just say yes.
I took 3 years of Latin and I still don't.
You're making these words up as you go.
No, I just don't remember.
John
one
Gucciardo
word.
accused me when I was in office of making up some of these Latin
Yes,
terms.
that's what I just said.
And I never denied that, actually, but I didn't consider that there were too many Latin scholars on Fort Myers Beach that could challenge me, so I got
Years.
away with it.
3 years of Latin,
Catholic school.
20-something years ago.
Take it home and research it, make sure it was properly used.
I think I burned that book.
I think that suggestion works fine. Yeah, I can make those so that they're similar format.
Good? Any comments, questions? Tim, Jim?
Thank you very much.
So we need, you need public hearing. I know we've
Was
discussed
that,
all
that
this.
wasn't, I didn't think that was a public hearing.
Oh, they did presentation, sorry.
The presentation wasn't a public hearing.
I would like to take public input if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, let's take public input. Any public comment? Leon?
Shaking his head.
Okay. Close public comment on that then. Moving on?
Do you have, I mean, can we do a recommendation of whether, move forward with these changes and finalizing some of these proposed recommendations that you've done and that we've done that? I mean, I'd like to get some clarity on,
Do we
that
want to recommend it, or do we want to see a clean version of it with changes? I mean, it's,
I'm assuming that the changes will be done correctly.
ask you for a favor to make a recommendation to move forward with the
okay,
changes.
we'll make a recommendation to move forward.
I would like to make that recommendation to move forward, but with a map.
Okay.
With a what?
Map.
Okay.
Second that.
All in favor?
We don't need to
No.
vote, do we?
I have one question about that. John Turner and I had discussed this last week. It's a fairly extensive document, and I asked him if we wanted that as an addendum in our land development code, which could be a big chunk of information, or if we just want to reference the survey description, like the description of the property, and then have where someone can access that survey if they need to come to town hall and get a copy of it, or how they want to do it.
That's fine as long as there's a place that they can find it easily.
There isn't a way to print a document that isn't extensively,
It's a
why would it be
7-mile
so
map.
difficult to have a map?
I'm
What
assuming you mean as an
It's 7
exhibit
miles
as
long.
part of this description, not adopting it as part of.
Oh, no,
Yeah,
I
that's-
wasn't asking to adopt
Okay,
it,
that's
but
what
I'm just saying.
if you wanted an
for-
addendum in the code.
For an example for council and for us, for
Yes.
next meeting, so that we can see what, because I wasn't 100% sure where you were talking about this, area to be, so now I'm a little more clear, but I would still like to have that little line on a piece of paper.
Yeah, that's not a problem at all.
So
Okay.
She first, you second,
I second it.
All in favor? Recommended
Aye.
with our changes? All right, there's your
Thank you.
recommendation.
So hopefully not all sections that we bring back will be like that, but there are, just to warn you, there is a lot of moving things around and trying to get, that's the hardest part, is trying to find the proper place for it and clearing, because once you move something somewhere, then it changes the context of other sections, so you will be seeing some of that, though, unfortunately. Not everything will be a clean, brand-new.
Next on the agenda is to recess as a local planning agency. Yes, we do. So,
I motion to recess as the local planning agency, and can I say open as the historical board,
all in one.
historical preservation board then?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So we are now as the Historic Preservation Board. And I'm going to turn it over to Scott, the chair.
I am so excited. We are official.
Yay!
So our first meeting is going to be 2 weeks from today.
Record, you mean the advisory committee,
HAC.
HAC, yes.
Yes, the HAC is now a legal body. We have 5 members. We still have 2 openings. Do you want to discuss when we're going to post those openings?
I'll check with Michelle, but I think what we talked about was posting it as an open until filled, instead of a specific deadline. Obviously, the sooner you get in, the sooner you can get on. But at this point, probably open until filled.
Lori and I, the LPA members will have 2-year terms to be congruent with their term on the LPA. The other members, 3 years. I think the 2 new members will be 2 years. Is that correct?
Correct. So the unfilled positions, whoever gets assigned to those will be assigned 2-year terms, whereas the members that are non-LPA members have the 3-year term that you referred to.
So we will be meeting on the 4th Tuesday of every month, except for December, because that's Christmas Day. You had asked me to provide you guys the 4 categories of historical importance. So I'll print this out for you for our next meeting, but just to review, there's what's called CH4, which is historical interest. That's like a vista or a view or a view corridor. We really haven't had anybody put in a vista yet, but that's what that is. Then there's CH3, which is historic significance. It includes structures that are located in and around historic districts. One would be the arches, if the arches ever came back, perhaps the pagodas on our street. So anything that adds to a historic area. And then there's CH2, which most of the buildings have gotten that category. So it's historic recognition. These are places like churches, schools. My building, the Sea Gypsy, was the first public library in Lee County. So that's kind of where the CH2 comes in. The CH1, the historic designation, that's when you're going after county, state, or national recognition. That'd be a place like the Mound House. So most buildings on this island. There's a few that would go CH1. Most of them are going to be CH2. One of our members compiled a list, and we have over 350 properties that we're targeting to get recognition.
Since that was put together, that list, how many of those have been torn down or whatever?
Several.
7? Only 7?
Several.
Oh,
Excuse me, Scott, what does CH stand for?
I guess while you're also looking at that,
Category of history.
very good.
Again?
Category of history.
Category of history. Okay. Now, what, in
Category-
your agency?
Well, actually, it's CHI. It's Category of Historical Importance. CHI. So it's CHI 4, CHI 3, CHI 2, and CHI 1.
Oh, it's CH, all right.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, now, and the name of the subgroup is
The Historical Advisory Committee.
the local advisory committee to the Historic Preservation Board,
Correct.
to the LPA, to the town of Fort Myers Beach.
got it.
Correct.
Correct.
You got it.
To the state of Florida. Okay, but when you come up with something, is this going to go from you to the Historic Preservation Board, and then?
It's going to go from, so let's say we get 5 applications next month. The HAC will look at them, and if they approve it, I'll bring it to the LPA under the HPB. And then it goes to town council.
Does it have to go that far? The town
Yeah,
council?
Some of them do, yes.
Yeah.
So the membership of the Historic Advisory Committee has to go all the way up to town council?
Oh, you're talking about the membership?
Yeah.
We
Oh,
d-
you're
Well, yeah,
talking-
yeah, so let me, yes.
Oh,
to
are you
answer
talking
that.
membership, or are you talking the house? Okay.
If I may, yes, so the town council appoints the, I think it's
Yes.
Historic Preservation Advisory Committee, HPAC, whatever,
Okay.
to the
I was confused.
Historic Preservation Board. But yes, the council appoints, and then they serve under the Historic Preservation
Yeah,
Board,
CNH.
which happens to be also the LPA.
So this is just one part of the HAC. We're looking at, our main goal is not only the recognition of cottages, but the preservation of cottages. So we're going to try to formulate a playbook whereby if there is a house that may get knocked down, what happened with Joe Orlandini and moving that was so on the queue that they made some mistakes. So we'd like to not only have a plan as if this happens again, how do we do it, but more importantly, where are these houses going to go? So we want to do 2 things. One, identify the cottages and have a process by which they can be moved, or at least documented digitally. And if we can save it, where can we move it? So.
Right,
That's kind of
and
the
a
goal.
defined permitting process, and,
Right, kind of a playbook. Hey,
Okay.
if somebody walked into Jason's office and said, "Hey, I've got this house. I just don't want to knock it down, and there's enough buzz on the beach that they want to keep it. What do I do? How do I do it?" So,
Right, so there's also, once you designate and recognize certain structures, there's processes that get put into place. You can't ever really deny a demolition or something like that of a structure, but there's other things that get triggered as far as preserving and opportunities that may be available for 30 to 60 days in the future once something's designated.
right. So you can at the least take pictures, document it. Secondly, you may want, there may be some light fixtures that can be moved. There might be some Florida pine that they can get out of that building, at least save some of the cottage. So those are some things we're going to be tackling next couple months.
On the administrative side, I guess, or the legislative side, I guess is what it is that committee reports to your board, your preservation board, which obviously is also the LPA. What we will do is, on the agendas, you'll have an agenda item of the Historic Preservation Board with sub-items of their meeting minutes, the HAC's meeting minutes, for reporting to you, or a report, whatever you guys do monthly. So we will do a better job of delineating that information and that flow of information for the public. And also so that you'll have it as a formalized agenda item under your Historic Preservation Board.
Starting next month. We're having a meeting, like I said, in 2 weeks, so hope we get that process down now that we're legal. I mean, there's nothing really to report back when because we weren't quote-unquote official, so hopefully we'll get the ball rolling.
So your January LPA and Historic Preservation Board meeting, you will have meeting minutes or a report from the November HAC. So that's because of the timeline, that's how it'll work, is basically the previous 2 months. You'll always be a month behind because they're on the fourth Tuesday and you're on the second. There's not time to get all the meeting minutes in, but the next month you'll get that stuff. So that's how in February you'll get December's if you had one and so on.
Questions? You got all the acronyms down, Dan?
Yeah, I'm fine.
HAC to the HPP to the LPA.
Everything Latin to add? Dominico Friscum?
We will assist you in making this a much
Yeah,
more
give me a moment, I
formalized
could work on
process.
something.
Okay.
Okay. I move to adjourn.
I second it. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We're now convened back as the LPA, and we're going, next on the agenda is the LPA member items and reports. I'm going to start down here with Tim. Do you have anything? Tim?
I just had a quick question. Jason, you'd mentioned last meeting that you had some training materials that you were
Yes.
potentially disseminating.
There's a lot. So there's a couple different ways we can do this. Actually, what's come up is I've talked to some other colleagues around the state and other APA Florida sections, and they've done section-wide training. And so one of the things I was going to do is get in touch with my colleagues at other communities in Lee County and Collier County and see if maybe we want to put on an event which would probably be sponsored by the Promised Land section of APA Florida. So if you can bear with me until maybe January, I think I can get you some things, but I think we can do a bigger event with all of or as many as we can get to come LPA members across our region. And if you're interested in that, I would like us to be part of that process to put that on.
Would that be here on the island or
We
somewhere
could,
else?
we'll look
Yeah.
at venues. The Heartland section did it, and they ended up getting people from multi-counties all around. Apparently, people are starving for this training, and it's ethics, and it's sunshine law, and it's all these other things. And there's several people that I've used to work for and do work with on a regular basis that give these presentations. So I just got to find out their time availability and willingness to come down to, I think coming to Fort Myers Beach wouldn't be too much of a problem for them. So, but that's my goal is, it went from just printing a bunch of stuff for you to maybe there's an opportunity to get you in a room with your fellow colleagues in other Sanibel and everywhere else and maybe learn together.
Sounds great. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, but in the meantime, I will try to find a more condensed, short course version to email you out. Because right now it's pretty much big packets that you'll get at a day-long seminar kind of thing, and I didn't want to just drop that off in your lap.
Have you guys gotten at least the LDC and everything like that, the big books?
I think I've given you the comp plan.
Comp plan, and we got the future land use map. I
Yep.
don't think we've gotten the LDC yet.
So I think we haven't updated the code of ordinances. I think we have a couple that I can hand to you for you to have that, for the LDC to be within that.
Dan asked for the procedures manual for his last meeting, and that was very helpful. So thank you. Yeah, which we got.
I recommend, I use the internet and I use the Municode online to search our codes just because it's easier to word search when we're talking about trying to find things. I like to find all the sections that word expendable is in or something like that. That's helpful to me. But yes, we'll get you a hard copy of the Code of Ordinances.
I brought up last meeting, because it's so visible and so many people have asked me questions about the property at the foot of the bridge owned by, I think, Mitch Cronin?
Yes.
And is that being flood-proofed to the level it's coming in at? Is that how it's being rebuilt?
So I'm trying to remember the level because that was a Lee County review. Yes, there's I think there's panels that were going to go on the doorways, if I'm not mistaken.
The question I have is that there were several restrictions on that property due to all of the utilities and things that come through there, that roof over was a separate building over what was existing. And it was expandable only to be temporary walls. Now I see very cement walls there. And I'm just curious, have there, when someone comes in with a new permit, do they go back to all the restrictions from before? Or do they just change everything?
It's hard for me to speak for, because it wasn't us that did the review on that, right? That was a Lee County review and permit.
Why?
Because it was under they were the building department. They were the flood review and the building official to review and approve those projects through at that time.
Well, my bigger question, I guess, is in the demo permit, I mean, they took it down to just basically the roof. So, I mean, that's more than 50%. So shouldn't it have to come up to height regulations?
And that was an approval that was done by Lee County. We weren't part of that review for the 50% rule. So apparently there's documentation that shows value, structure, and what was done. And I can't speak to what was done by phases, but I can continue to research that if you want, but it's...
Well, I just recall that the only way they could expand like John Richard did when he added his hurricane shutter space that was open was that it was open space. And it certainly looks to be solid space now. And I'm just curious how that got revised.
I have not looked at the structural plans to see, like you're talking about the relationship between the adjacent buildings, to see if there was something there that created a caveat to the flood regulations or some other, I don't want to say loophole, but you know what I mean.
Well, and my real concern is if the reasoning behind that extension being temporary or open space is because of the utilities that are all gathered there. Now they're under 4 foot of cement. And I'm just wondering if there was anything, I mean, that's the way I remember it being permitted before. And, you know, John and Mitch did those two at the same time and got that added space as open space. But, you know, I guess I don't really have the clear picture of what that is, because I guess they have the breakaway cement, kind of, at the bottom. But the interior is solid cement 4 feet, so I don't understand how that's really a breakaway.
Which part? So you have a floor and you
Well,
have
you
your
have the
walls,
little
which are two different.
breakaway, you have the holes at the bottom like all houses have to have of cement structure.
Right.
But their interior pour is a 4 foot cement pour.
Oh, I didn't know that there was a 4 foot interior pour. You're talking about the floor structure, is that? 4 foot. Okay. Again, I don't know the structural design. I haven't looked at that. I'm not a structural engineer expert, but according to the reviewer and the building official and the agency that reviewed it, which they're generally have been pretty reliable, it met the regulations.
But the restrictions that were put on it was from the town of Fort Myers Beach. And that's the interesting thing, that they're reviewing it, but whether they had any of our information on that. Because it came before the LPA and the town council for approval for those expansions.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, the only thing I saw since I've been here, it's been, God, 15 months now, 14 months, was a reduction. They modified the building. There was a permit that went through that modified like a 200 square foot reduction in the footprint, something like that. Before that, it had already all been approved, is my understanding. I don't remember the date that it was approved, but so that was all through the Lee County process of our interlocal.
We'll take a look, Jane.
But
curious.
But
I
if you're-
would love
yes.
to have a better
And
look.
I'll get you an email.
Thanks, appreciate it.
so, yeah, so if your question, yes, I understand what you're saying now. I thought it was just a building permitting question, but I guess it's the relationship between that and prior approval
Right.
of the
I mean,
space itself. I
you know,
understand.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think you have to go backwards to go forward,
Understood.
or you should have to. Okay, that's it, I guess.
Very good.
So the town council meeting went well. I think I was called on just about every issue, especially the last couple on Denora, so I highly recommend that we get a rotation going to be present at every meeting. And I made the ask for a joint meeting with town council. Do you have?
They
enough-
set a date on that? I don't think they did.
I thought you said you were going to get it to us
Well,
in that meeting.
you
Because
can,
I know Mayor Gore said that in a meeting that they had already put a date on, and she asked you what that date was or something. It was kind of a confusing little thing, encounter there, and I thought you said that you were going to look at it and get back with us.
but
Well,
they
when
have to
I
set the
asked-
When I
date.
watched
2
the
months.
video.
They have to set a date.
So they still have to set the date.
Yeah, so I wasn't in the end of the meeting. I think because you did it in the beginning, that
Correct.
they were going to wait till the end and do it during their normal administrative stuff, and I think maybe they didn't do it then. So I'll double check with Roger to see if they actually set a date, because I wasn't in the meeting at the end.
Does that have to be done on public record to set the date? I know our meeting does, but setting the date, can it just be done administratively through a
I'm-
series of emails?
Probably.
Well, when
But-
I made the request 2 months ago when I went, they told me that it had to be a request from Jason from us.
No, I thought they said they wanted a official agenda before they
Gave them an
would.
agenda.
yeah.
I gave them 3 items that we
I have it,
desperately need to speak with them about.
which was rounding up, pre-disaster build back, and the vacating of properties were the 3 things that we approached them with.
They have everything that you need to get to that point, is my understanding. It's just, I don't know if the official date was set, so.
What it's worth, I'm going to be out of the country December 2nd till the 16th of December. So I'm going to miss the next meeting. I'll send an email. They can get excused absence.
You're
That's
out
all
of
I
the
have.
country. Is that all you have,
That's all I have. Thank you.
Lori?
Just something that was brought up last time, I'd like to reiterate. On Thursday, when I got the email that our packet was ready, I was sitting in Punta Gorda Airport and wasn't coming back until Sunday, and Monday was a holiday. So I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to ask my brother to print out 125 pages. Well, fortunately, that didn't happen, but again, just a request, can we get it sooner?
Yes.
Please?
Yep. So, and I understand. And unfortunately, I made a decision to try to wait to get something else on, and it didn't work out, so. Sorry about that.
And Miss Lori?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Thank
Mr.
you,
Hughes?
Megan.
You know, on this, I've been watching on the television and reading about the issues on Denora and what the town council has done on matters that have come before us. And apparently they punted on this last issue and granted the gentleman that wanted the swimming pool, they granted him what they call a special something permit, use permit or something.
Temporary use permit,
Temporary
right-of-way
use
permit.
permit.
I think we're going to classify it as a right-of-way permit.
But I've been thinking about that issue, and in the last minutes, I mentioned that the prior attorney that gentleman relied on her opinion of riparian rights, and I had stated that I didn't see that was relevant at all, and I've looked at the definition of riparian rights and kind of refresh my recollection of what riparian rights and to me that has no relevance whatsoever. Riparian rights deal with the rights in the water itself, but don't give you right to acquire land that already exists. But the question I would have that came up in my mind, we have always assumed that the land between the platted area and the seawall was the town's. It would be the town's, and Jack, you help me on this, only if the original developer dedicated it to the town, and did he in fact do that? Otherwise, that land would belong to the heirs of the original developer, and the town would have no authority to vacate it, wouldn't own it. But I've never seen the original plat, what that was platted, and so that the title to that land, do we correctly assume that the town does own that land?
the plat dedication is rather, all it says is the waterways. Now, what is that? So we
It
can-
didn't exist at the time it was platted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, kind of wrestling with it.
Uh-huh, okay.
However, there was, I mean, yes, there was boundaries defined and described by that plat, and, you know, I go round and round whether something's dedicated to the public or it's dedicated for access by the public. That's kind of applicable to anything that's platted between 1908 and 1960s, really.
But if it's not dedicated at all, then
Right, I believe that
the-
plat has a reference to public access and a public right-of-way, essentially, some type of reference to that. So
Yeah.
how that gets interpreted on the legal side is different, but it looks on the face of it that it's been functioned as public right-of-way. The question, your point is, the question is between the built land and this invisible line that's recorded and platted. That's the question. I'm telling the council you treat it like a driveway. Seawalls and boat docks and that sort of thing. We grant, as a town, grant access to right-of-way and grant access to roadways. Doesn't mean that you own it all of a sudden. You don't own to the edge of pavement, but you're getting a permit for the right of access through our right-of-way and to that edge of pavement.
I think when he was talking about the previous attorney, I think he was more looking at detrimental reliance.
what was that?
Detrimental reliance. He was relying on the attorney's email and opinion.
Right.
That it was
But
not
that
really.
attorney said that they had, that was the right to build on that because they had acquired it by riparian rights.
The only
Yeah.
reference we saw in the email, and that's part of the reason, what I told you guys last time was, and again, I don't want to, the email and the 5-foot setback had no context to it.
Yeah.
So
You
I
don't-
would assume that seawalls are on lot lines also. So if somebody asked me that question, maybe you say, okay, 5 feet. I don't know. We don't know. We don't know the context or the way the question was really discussed. I don't know.
Right.
That's why.
Well, I'm just bringing that up. You don't acquire land, title of land by riparian rights. Riparian rights give you the right to the use of adjacent waterways. And a riparian deals with if it's a navigable river or something. If it's the ocean or a bay, it's called littoral rights, littoral rights. But I just wanted to eliminate that whole concept that there was riparian rights here. And the other issue was, is what the original plat provided in terms of whether that was in fact dedicated for public purposes.
I would say it appears so. Obviously, we can discuss, or
Yeah.
separately can be discussed what those terms mean, but it appears on the face of it, yes. There are other canals in the town that are supposedly privately owned too, but may have an public easement on them. So there's a lot of circumstances.
Okay, Jason, last
ma'am.
time we were together, you said you would put on high-level reviews of rounding up and pre- and post-disaster for us. It's in the minutes, too. I didn't know if you
So-
got around to that, or,
I was afraid this one would take too long, that we just did,
okay.
and it was critical. So December, I would prefer to discuss the evaluation appraisal report items that I didn't put on this one because I wanted this text amendment to go through. If you want to talk about some of those other items high level, I do have a draft report dealing with landscaping and parking issues related to surplus parking and other items that are on the list. We can go over that. My thought was on the rounding up thing is, do you want to go and address and talk about that before you have your joint meeting?
I think we probably need to do a review of it
Okay.
and to bring everyone up to speed and everyone up to the same level of information on all of these specific topics, as we all have input on this. So I'd like to see some high-level reviews of those before.
What I'll do is, I think what we talked about before is the language that exists, the sections. Probably I can do a couple examples, hopefully physical, like a lot, show you on an overhead or something, and then walk you through the kind of the math and the examples of how it applies, and then where it applies. I think I talked about that a little bit at the Realtors Association, try to give examples of square foot, but I think seeing it would help make sense to you all. So I'll do that. That should hopefully be 15-minute presentation and 20-minute discussion. So we'll allot 30, 40 minutes for that, if that's okay with you.
Fine.
I won't get into text changes or any of that stuff. We'll just talk about what it is and how it's done. Okay. And then the ear stuff will probably take an hour to discuss,
Okay.
maybe longer.
I think that was the third piece on that reviews that you would do, high-level reviews you would do for us.
Plus the ear, I have one more conversation to have with people that were previously involved in the process, so I want to make sure I haven't missed anything. And then you'll have it in December.
Thank you. Appreciate that. We have 2 town council meetings coming up, November 19th and December 6th. I am out of town on the 19th. Can anyone attend the 19th? And we have one December 6th as well. I'd like to make sure we have somebody at both of those meetings. If anyone can,
Remember what?
6th
I've got sand sculpting, I can't.
on the
Okay.
19th?
Yeah.
Can anyone else attend the 19th meeting?
Which one are we talking about now?
Let's start with the November 19th one, which is next coming Monday.
Jane, can you make it? I might be able to move. I'll do it. I'll move some stuff around.
Do you know if there's anything on the agenda that came through the LPA that might potentially be on that? That we need
The thing
somebody?
you just heard today.
Hmm?
The thing you just heard today.
Okay, so so I guess the EC recommendations are going through on the 19th. Okay. All
And
right,
in your next LPA meeting, I think we have a schedule drafted for you. Obviously, you guys will have to look at that. But for the year, you asked us just to assign for those meetings as they rotate. And I think we've drafted something like that for you.
December 6th? Is it,
So
is
the
there
s-
anything
so the
lingering out
6th
there that would be on the 6th?
The 6th will be the second meeting of what you just heard today.
Okay.
And won't it be Lighthouse too?
I'm sorry, Lighthouse is,
Second.
Second hearing, they put that over for second hearing, and,
we are doing, no, the second hearing was on the 19th, I think.
yeah.
It is-
Lighthouse?
Yeah, so Monday is the
Oh,
Lighthouse. I'm sorry,
Okay,
yes.
yeah,
Let me look.
I'll be there Monday.
All right, so let me look at,
Oh, December 6th?
I think I can do the 6th if no one else can.
I could too.
Take your pick.
You go ahead, Dan, and I'll
No, who
pick
else
something
wanted
up
to
in
do it? I
January.
mean-
That would be better for me anyway.
There was somebody else that was available too on the 6th, was it?
December 6th is a Thursday. Is that a MMP? Did I mistaken? All right, so it would be 3rd, wouldn't it?
I don't think you'll have from last month. You won't have anything on there that came from the LPA.
We're okay on the 3rd?
Yeah.
I'm in town, so if something happens, so it sounds like there's nothing from the LPA on the December 3rd meeting at this moment.
Is December 3rd instead of the 6th?
Yeah, I
Sixth
mistakenly
is
said-
the M and
M&P.
P, Dan.
6th is what?
Not a,
MMP, Management and Planning.
not a town council meeting.
It's not a true
so you
council
don't
meeting.
have-
It's a
Oh.
planning
If you
session
want
for.
to go the 3rd, the next one.
So, I mean, if you're open for the 3rd, watch the agenda. If there's something from the LPA, then attend. If not, then I don't think we need to have a representative there.
I'll volunteer knowing that there's nothing that they're going to be discussing.
Darn, okay.
Smart move.
Smart move, so,
Okay.
and December 6th is tentatively Dan, so we have those next 2 meetings covered. I think that's all I have for right now. Anything else before we adjourn? No, oh, gotta read the agenda. LPA attorney items.
Nothing for me. Thank you.
Still here.
Still here?
We're anticipating being here through the 17th.
Community development, Jason.
I think we've talked about it all. I'm good.
Any more items for next month's agenda? Anything else you'd like to see on it? All right, public comment. All right,
He was so impressed by our erudite discussion.
Said he doesn't know any Latin,
Correct.
so he has
All
nothing
right,
to
Right.
say.
number three.
He's nodding.
I forgot one thing.
Okay,
The American Sand Sculpting starts Friday, and we desperately need some volunteers. So if you want to come out and help, we'd certainly appreciate it. They have a morning and afternoon shift any day. You get a free T-shirt and you get free lunch.
darn, I'll be out of town.
Of course you are.
And let's wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving and safe travels if they're going someplace.
I forgot one thing. Jason, on, we have our LDC books. Mine is at least 2 years, 3 years old.
Do you have separate land development code books, or do you have the code
We
of
all have
ordinances?
separate books. Do we want to call them in, or do we want to, you want to publish the links to all of this, and we can start looking electronically? What's the rule here? I mean, our books are getting old.
You don't have the code of ordinances, you have the actual land development code pages. Let me check with Michelle to see if we have books that we're updating from the code of ordinances, because it's got
Okay.
the LDC within it, plus all the other stuff. And they're bound usually. I don't know if we have enough, but I'll check
that'd
on
be
that.
Because when referencing things, they're just not matching up.
Yeah, yeah.
The other thing that maybe you might handle in the meantime is send out the links that you mentioned here for, the electronic version of our code, the maps that we can see, Lee County for our new members as well. And send it out via email. Sorry, that was the last of what I had on my list of things here.
Thank you.
A motion to adjourn?
Second it?
All in favor?
Aye.
Well, wasn't that fun? Sorry we didn't make your time frame. You can fill in whatever you want for us.
Oh, my.